I have the great pleasure of welcoming back to Green, Mirko is so am I. He took our Canevaro in the kingdom. I don't know how to use the word in this present. He took his doctorate in, and then went on to temporary depending on where he now chair in Greek history. Mirko has philological roots. His first book, his doctoral dissertation, discusses the authenticity or lack of documents embedded in the text of Greek orators, and in particular of Austen's. Because those texts were very alleged texts of Athenian laws, their first project involved a computation with Athenian law, which has remained a key part of his research since. Mirko is one of the two editors of Greek law, alongside his supervisor, Harris. Mirko's work has something to do with the people who talk, one might say. All his most important contributions to Aristotle's Politics, in which he worked alongside this gives you a sense of his interest in both Athenian institutions, political institutions, but also the practice is a game-changing project, majority versus liberation. Shame may persuade me to bring it out finally. But of course, the draft drawing at his feet, and what he's going to talk about today is actually Zukunftswissenschaft. It's future research on a project that will be funded by the European Research Council, the ERC, on class struggle in ancient Greek democracy. So Mirko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nino. Here. Okay. Yeah, so thank you very much for having me. What I aim to do today, by Nino, is to present a project that I haven't yet really started. We actually start in September, so be ready for many, many promises, very few results. At this stage, my hope is to gather insights and feedback, and I am very grateful for the opportunity that the Turin Humanities Program, the Fondazione 1563 and the Compagnia di San Paolo are giving me to tell you about what I have in mind tonight. And so yeah, it's good to give this kind of talk about big plans in this context and before making mistake by actually doing the work. So that's good. So to make a long story short, very short, before making it a bit longer again, this project that I'm about to start with collaborators and all, aims to put class at the center of the historical reconstruction of ancient Greek belongs. It contends that class struggle and class dynamics grounded in the economic relations and occupational structures of the Greek cities and manifesting themselves in the wider texture of social, political, and cultural positions are fundamental to our understanding of the emergence, the nature, and the development of Greek democracies. This perspective, I contend, finds much purchase in our classical and Hellenistic sources, both in the direct evidence for political struggles and oppositions, and in the contemporary reflection on Greek politics and democracy. Class, for instance, plays a central role in the political analysis of Aristotle. In his view, the citizenry of any polis could be divided into two parts, the rich, the plusioi, and the poor, the penetes. In the politics, we find further complex subdivisions of these categories based on occupation and economic pursuit. And it tightly links the constitution of any given city to the socioeconomic organization of its citizenry and the broader nature of its economy. Of course, it's not just him, it's everybody, really. And the struggle between these two classes for dominance and the instantiation of the preferences of the dominant side in the oligarchic or democratic constitutions lies at the heart of Aristotle's analysis. For this keen observer and analyst of the politics of his day, thinking about Greek politics is possible. It is therefore somewhat surprising that class has been all but abandoned as an explanatory concept by most modern scholars of ancient Greek politics, not to mention by social and economic historians. This rejection of class has its own historical explanations. In part, the murderous excesses and eventual downfall of so-called Marxist political regimes, especially Soviet Russia. In part, the rigidity of doctrinaire Marxism and its fall from academic grace in the last 30 years or so. It is this project's contention that a more flexible and integrated notion of class, informed by both the best Marxist historiography and by important work in sociology, is essential for putting the concept back where Aristotle placed it, at the heart of the analysis of ancient Greek politics and society. Pursuing a new approach to Greek democracy that puts class dynamics and class struggle at the center of our investigation is, of course, I'm very much aware, a risky proposition. For some scholars, class is an outdated category associated with discredited forms of Marxism and obsolete political regimes, and there is a risk that such an approach could be dismissed a priori on the basis of long-held ideas and prejudices. At the same time, the current climate provides an opportunity. While growing inequality has been putting class analysis back on the political and cultural agenda, how class analysis should be carried out is no longer tied to political orthodoxies and party loyalties. The road is clear to experiment, to try and combine different traditions and methods of class analysis, and I believe, I hope, that the results will be transformative for our understanding of Greek democracy and society, also providing perhaps a path for reintroducing class more prominently into other areas of historical investigation. So in what follows, since, as I said, I haven't done the work yet, I will first present an analytical and somewhat overcritical state of the art in scholarship before trying to give you a sense of how I hope and plan to proceed in the project. So discussion of class struggle and class analysis have found, as I mentioned, little purchase in scholarship on the history of the Greek world and of the Greek polis in particular. The main trends in the field for the past 50 years and beyond have either explicitly declared or implied that modern Marxist ideas of class are by and large inapplicable to the Greek world. Scholars like Geoffroy de St. Croix, Ellen Maxine-Wood, and Peter Rose, who have attempted to read the development of the Greek polis through the lenses of Marxist notions of class struggle, have overall been marginal to mainstream debates. Where Marxist categories have been central to ancient historical debates, as in France, in the school of Vernant and Vidal-Naquet, and with the work of Nicole Leroux, and in Italy, in the debates that in the 1970s centered around Istituto Gramsci, other themes have taken center stage, often to the exclusion of the very possibility of class analysis. A key reason for the failure of class analysis in Greek history and the UK and the US, with wide-ranging consequences also in other national traditions, was the astonishing success of Moses Finlay's work on the ancient economy, which remained the orthodox position from the 1970s until about a decade ago. Despite having been a member of the US Communist Party, Finlay renounced his Marxism is early Marxist, and pursued eventually a Weberian approach to ancient Greek society. Finley's influence against the use of class-based analysis has two main strengths, and these are very important. First, his view of ancient society stressed a spectrum of statuses or orders that was explicitly opposed to class in both descriptive and analytical terms, an approach that remains influential today. In his view, the fact that the economy was inextricably linked, embedded, to use Polanyi's category, within the religious, legal, and most of all political spheres, per se invalidated the very possibility of class analysis, with its attention to the economic underpinnings of social differentiation and its relational and oppositional view of how social differentiation occurs. The result of this position is, to me, what is turned in many vulgarized versions into an unsatisfactory picture of juxtaposed social strata defined primarily on the basis of political or legal differences, arranged in a pyramidal and hierarchical social structure that leaves very little room for conflict and opposition between groups. Second, and more importantly, his view of the ancient economy denied the possibility of growth and heavily downplayed the role of commerce and manufacture, painting a picture of a static agrarian world largely composed of self-sufficient peasant citizens. In other words, a world in which the growing economic complexity that often drives the development of class relations barely existed, and social stratification proper and economic dependency were limited to the distinct status of foreigners and slaves. This picture of the ancient economy has come under increased scrutiny in recent years and has been effectively overturned, and I'll come back to this when I start saying what I think we should do next. But because he denied both the possibility of class struggle and the reality of economic dynamism, Finley's widely influential model was resistant to tackling questions of change, social, political, and economic. Yet, as Armando Emiliano once observed, talking about Finley, as changes do happen, it is desirable that they should be explained. And one of the quaint formulation that we all love, anyway. Studies of the political history of the Greek cities, whether Athens or the democratic regimes that became predominant in the Hellenistic period after the so-called Great Convergence towards democratic form of the late 4th century BC, have also been, by and large, hostile to reading Greek democracies in terms of class. This general hostility has been a common thread across often incommensurable approaches. Thus, if it is unsurprising that the institutional and heavily epigraphical study of the Greek polis, whether of classical Athens or of the Hellenistic democracies, has largely been blind to class dynamics, it is perhaps more striking that they should play such a small role also in explicitly anti-institutionalist approaches that stress the importance of the social, ideological, and cultural dimension of Greek politics. Thus, for instance, the ongoing debate, one of the most lively and hotly contested in current Greek history, on how democratic Hellenistic democracy truly was, refers constantly to the relative influence of mass and elite, investigating to what extent the centrality of honors and for benefactors led to the formation of a stratum of notables, as in Paul Venn and Friedrich Quass, or conversely, whether the need for the elites to attract honors from the demos gave the masses a modicum of control, as in the work of Philippe Gautier and more recently in the work of John Ma. Yet these categories, mass, elite, notables, and so on, are left in this school of thought and of historical work largely indefinite from an economic and even social point of view. What were the economic underpinnings of the notables' prominence, of their wealth? What economic dynamics marked their relations with the lower classes? Was there direct or indirect exploitation going on? What forms of social distinction, grounded for instance in lifestyle, cultural tastes, marked this basic opposition? How did social hierarchies, or lack thereof, structure daily social interactions? Similar blind spots have long plagued the more institutionally oriented studies of Athenian democracy, of which the most influential are those by my old supervisor, P.J. Rhodes, and by Mogens Hansen, recently deceased and much lamented. There, abstract notions of popular participation often lack the necessary grounding in an appreciation of the social reality of working people's lives. Who is this demos that is in control of the institutions? Yet they are found, these blind spots, also in scholarly approaches that explicitly showcase the cultural and social dimension of Athenian politics, focusing on notions such as ideology and imaginaire, most prominently in the work of Josh Hover and Nicole Leroux. Josh Hover's hugely influential study explicitly foregrounds the dichotomy between mass and elite, painting a picture of Athenian ideology as expressing the worldview of the masses, to which the elites need to subscribe to be able to pursue prominence and prestige through intra-elite competition adjudicated by the demos. It is remarkable, however, how both mass and elite remain, in his study, rather indeterminate concept, devoid of real economic, even social content. Bracketing out, in line with Finley's model, the economic dimension of democracy allows Ober to paint the Athenian political system as the expression of a fairly stable trade-off between popular control and redistribution. This form of adjudicatory popular control was, that is, a payback of sorts for the persistence of high economic inequality and the lack of true redistribution. This trade-off was accepted across the board, its ideological underpinnings embraced by mass and elite alike, and Ober's model leaves little room for social conflict and makes, for instance, the elite appeal of the oligarchic regimes after the Lamian War in 321 very hard to explain. Equally groundbreaking and influential has been Nicole Leroux's study of Athenian funeral speeches as evidence of the ideology or the imaginaire of Athenian democracy. Unlike Ober, Leroux held that the ideology expressed in this text is resolutely aristocratic, and that Athenian democracy was undermined from the inside, I'm quoting, by aristocratic values and representations. In her work, a rejection of Marxism's real or alleged economic determinism and a healthy determination to valorize the cultural dimension of politics is in dialogue with the Marxist critical toolbox. So Athenian democratic ideology emerges as a form of false consciousness that underpins elite domination. The actual economic and social distinctions and oppositions in Athenian society end up playing little role in such accounts, and even the widespread focus on ideology, despite its Marxist undertones, is divorced from economic relations and attached to the political community as a whole, rather than antagonistically to particular groups, to particular classes. The demos is a thing, is an essentialized thing in this tradition of scholarship. In somewhat and sometimes polemical dialogue with these approaches that I have just discussed, other scholarly traditions have read the history of the polis almost exclusively in terms of elite competition. This model has been very prominent in studies of processes of polis formation, which had denied, for instance, that written statutes, the first writing of Greek laws, and progressive institutionalization and state formation should be read in terms of opposition and compromise between leaders and the demos, elites and the demos. Such models have had the pernicious effect, I think, first, of obliterating binary distinctions between free and slave and between many and few that are omnipresent in our sources. Second, to assume that there were no differences in values and concerns at different points of the social ladder. Third, of dissolving the demos into a plurality of atomized individuals attempting individually to achieve elite status, rather than acknowledging popular agency in dynamics of institutionalization across the centuries. Similar tendencies have developed since the 1980s to read more and more even civil conflict in the classical and Hellenistic cities, also exclusively in terms of elite competition, denying political agency to the lower classes and seeing them at most as mobilized as patsies or sort by this or that faction for elite purposes. We find this model in an early and rather sophisticated version in Hans-Joachim Gerke's standard monograph on Stasis, and we find it now also, for instance, in a recent book by Henning Burns on Stasis in the Hellenistic cities. Despite the strong focus on social history of much Greek history since the 1980s, historians, rather than questioning these approaches and fleshing out the economic and social dimension of the prototypical opposition between mass and elite, have become, paradoxically, even more reluctant to acknowledge the relevance of class to the social and political life of the Greek cities. This has come as a side effect of a new and welcome, to be sure, focus on subaltern groups such as women, foreigners, and slaves. Since the 1970s, studies of women and foreigners have been added to studies of slavery, that were there already, as subfields in their own right. Subsequent studies have generally not treated these groups in full dialogue with each other and the free populace. Rather, each topic has become somewhat balkanized along the area studies model, as exemplified in a spate of recent handbooks and companions on women and gender and slavery and childhood and so forth. Whilst many advances have been made under this balkanized approach, opportunities have been missed to relate these subjects to a larger framework of oppositions, including class oppositions. In particular, and this is in a way the crisis of the recent years, scholars have often seen cornered by this new appreciation of the experience of slaves, women, and foreigners into taking one of two routes when tackling the issue of how the social reality of the Greek cities mapped onto the political structures of Greek democracy. Either they have underplayed or sidelined the reality of slave exploitation and female domination, and tackled Greek democracy as a purely political phenomenon, assessing it for citizen participation, equality, or conversely, for signs of elite predominance within the citizen body, as in The Rise and Fall of Classical Greece by Josh Ober, which hardly mentions slaves at all, and that is a sad fact of an otherwise interesting book. Or they have put all the emphasis on the reality of slave exploitation and the exclusion of women and foreigners, and dismissed the dichotomy between many and few in the Greek cities as little more than an intra-elite squabble, characterizing the entire citizen population of the Greek cities, however democratic their constitutions, as de facto an oligarchic minority. Even where, as in France and Italy, there have been strong traditions of engagement with Marxism, these have shared many basic presuppositions with the trends that I have just described. The overarching concern to denaturalize the capitalist mode of production and historicize it has led scholars to overemphasize, in my opinion, how distinctive the ancient economy and ancient society were, denying the importance of production and exchange, painting the ancient economy as a consumer economy, and stressing the centrality of political structures and formal legal statuses as the only sites of very limited social contention. In this resolutely pre-modern, pre-capitalist, and pre-market world, notions of class struggle and ideological warfare grounded in class struggle lose much of their explanatory value. Of course, there are exceptions to this trend, and I head here towards the end of this critical state of the art. The main exception to these trends is found, as I mentioned before, in the work of the few Marxist British and American Greek historians, like Geoffrey de St. Croix, Ellen Maxine Wood, and Peter Rose. There, class struggle does take center stage, yet the argument for its importance is weakened by a certain doctrinaire Marxism and by the need to insert it into a world of weak labor differentiation with little room for growth, market exchange, and profit-oriented economic activity. For these scholars, the search for class struggle leads to an almost obsessive concentration on issues of land tenure, as the control of land is considered the only viable form of control of the means of production. However, much of the evidence, and there's a lot of evidence, for active class oppositions in the classical and Hellenistic cities seems to concern, rather, a world of urban craftsmen, mechanics, and laborers which finds little room in such a model. Moreover, the need to find actual direct economic exploitation to identify class struggle in line with a certain doctrinaire Marxism means that ultimately the only real instance of class struggle becomes that between exploitative elites and exploited slaves. The free poor, central to actual instances of political and social struggle in the sources, become difficult to situate, as they are by and large not directly exploited. Thus, the active class struggle we do see ends up being barely class struggle at all, and the only real class struggle becomes inactive, implicit in the exploitation of slaves. Desancroix is led by this paradox to focus almost exclusively on exploitation of slaves by the elites, while Maxime Wolff, conversely, is led to deny the centrality of slavery altogether to Athenian economy and society, and to present a picture of Athenian democracy as structured around the class struggle between the wealthy and the peasant citizen, often a tenant farmer in a reconstruction. This problematic dichotomy reproduces another, which we have just discussed, that between approaches that valorize the egalitarian qualities of Greek democracies, denying the importance of slavery, and those that dismiss the citizen populations as oligarchies sui generis. These trends in the study of the social, political, and economic history of the Greek city-states display, I believe, and I've made the case a bit harder than perhaps I should have, but that's the point. I need to say why I need to do this, so take this with a pinch of salt. I have much admiration for many of the people I mentioned, but I need to explain how I want to do it differently, so that there's no point in walking on eggshells, I guess. So these trends display important deficiencies, I believe, and blind spots, yet present new opportunities for a productive reintegration of class into our interpretive frameworks. It is my contention that a conscientious, pragmatic, and historically sensible approach to class analysis can both correct problematic trends in the study of the Greek polis and lead to a better integration of several promising new approaches. So, in what time I have left, I will try to draw the contours of such an approach and of the ways in which I believe it might succeed in renewing the study of Greek history, at least to some extent. So, there we go. We're getting there. To be truly productive, in my opinion, class analysis applied to the Greek world needs, first of all, to embrace the most recent developments in the study of the ancient economy, bringing them to bear on dynamics of labor conditions and relations, and on the reconstruction of political and ideological opposition along class lines. The new understanding of the ancient Greek economy that has emerged in the last 20 years or so, based on a lot of very pragmatic work on inscriptions and on the archaeology and so on, understands it as dynamic, sophisticated, reliant on market exchange, and this new picture, and with significant labor specialization and reliant on market exchange. This new, what am I reading here? Okay, yeah. So I believe this opens new avenues for investigating the economic underpinnings of class beyond land tenure, acknowledging the centrality of craftsmen, artisans, and non-agricultural workers to the economic and political life of the Greek cities. I'll get back to this point in a couple of minutes, but now I want to open up other problems. Second, to be truly productive, I believe that a concern with class opposition and the articulation of class identities needs to be injected into several current debates, to turn generic references, for example, to elite and masses in discussions of political unrest or of popular control and elite capture in Greek democracies into something more concrete and grounded in actual social and economic life. Likewise, our renewed attention to class will make a properly intersectional analysis of subaltern groups, including women, foreigners, and slaves, truly possible. Third, I think we need to embrace a more flexible and less dogmatic notion of class, integrating both Marxist insights, particularly from the work of the most outstanding Marxist historians of other periods, E.P. Thompson in primis, who has made hardly any impact on ancient history, and nobody seems to have read The Making of the English Working Class, well, we all should, and also the tools of class analysis introduced by the sociology, for example, of Pierre Bourdieu, and used productively in recent years in groundbreaking studies of class oppositions, for instance, in France and Britain and across historical periods. The most common objection to Marxist class analysis is its alleged economic determinism. As class relations are, it is said, determined by the relations of production, class analysis is reduced to reading or superimposing on complex historical realities notions of exploitation and of the extraction of a surplus that relegate wider social, political, and cultural dynamics to the level of superstructure, dependent on the economic structure. In reality, Marxist scholars working in the tradition of Gramsci and Althusser have long shown that in processes of class formation, ideological and institutional dynamics are not mechanically derived from economic relations, and have stressed that these two dimensions should be understood dialectically. In finding our own methodological and theoretical toolbox, I think this project will need to favor those approaches to class, whether Marxist or non-Marxist, that are capable of being integrated in productive synergies. Marxist approaches focusing on domination and exploitation can in fact be productively combined with sociological approaches stressing cultural forms of group distinction and forms of exclusionary class-based opportunity hoarding, as is being called, for example, by Owen Wright along the Weberian tradition. As it happens, there are significant points of contact between what has probably been the most productive example of Marxist historiography in the 20th century, the work of E.P. Thompson, and what has been certainly the most influential sociological approach to class in the second half of the 20th century, that of Pierre Bourdieu. First, both approaches lend themselves to historical analysis in the sense that they understand class, in E.P. Thompson's words, not as a structure, not even as a category, but as something which in fact happens and can be shown to have happened in human relationships. Thompson famously described class as a historical relationship, something that is shared by Bourdieu's sociology, with its stress on the dimension of the temporal accumulation of different kinds of capital and on social reproduction across time. The social world is accumulated history, he wrote. Second, both approaches understand class relationally, even oppositionally. In Thompson's words, we cannot have two distinct classes, each with an independent being, and then bring them into relationship with each other. Class happens when some men, as a result of common experiences, inherited or shared, feel and articulate the identity of their interests as between themselves and as against other men whose interests are different from and usually opposed to theirs. For Bourdieu, individuals come to have a certain position in the social space through mechanisms of distinction. Certain forms of social, cultural, and symbolic capital are not significant in themselves, but become significant only relationally, inasmuch as they allow individuals to be recognized as members of a particular class and not of another. This approach could not be more different from the film-inspired notion of a spectrum of statuses, which has dominated Greek social history for decades. That approach relied on a notion of status as quasi-institutional and static, defined by rights and duties, expectations and prerogatives, which are there independently of whether people engage with them or not. It is an intrinsically non-relational category, this kind of status. As a result, it observes notional statuses sequentially, one on top of the other, as a finite series frozen in time. The approach I'm talking about, on the other hand, does not attempt to provide a list of distinct classes, but rather focuses on the economic, social, and cultural oppositions that play out over time in the social space, allowing us to observe historically multiple class oppositions, at times overlapping, at times inconsistent. Third, both approaches pay due attention to the economic dimension of class relations, yet avoid determinist extremes and stress the centrality of culture and politics. Thompson famously observed that if class experience is largely determined by the productive relations into which men are born or enter involuntarily, class consciousness, on the other hand, is the way in which these experiences are handled in cultural terms, embodied in traditions, value systems, ideas, and institutional forms. So if the experience appears as determined, class consciousness does not, and the making of the working class, that was his contention, is a fact of political and culture as much as economic history. This stress on the cultural and political dimension of class relations and on its embodied nature cannot but remind one of Bourdieu's idea that different forms of capital, economic, social, cultural, are embodied through habitus, and opens the door for forms of class analysis that valorize cultural tastes, religious practices and beliefs, haircuts, as we were saying this morning in the room next to this, and deeper forms of morality embedded in traditional values. So, taking inspiration from these approaches and many other I'm sure I'll discover as I work on this, in tackling Greek democratic societies will allow us to engage in the study of occupational and labor relation and of how these condition social and political identities without needing to abandon any of the major advances that have characterized the study of Greek culture, politics, and ideology and society in the last few decades. So for the project I have identified, I just had to put this one, Polizia di Volpello, in provincia di Alessandria, ragazzi, non si può, sono obbligato, scusatemi. Comunque, con un po' con sofferenza mi sposto da questa slide e vi faccio vedere questa invece. So, I have identified 4 main areas of investigation, which I won't investigate on my own. I'm hiring people, I'm getting some colleagues that are working with me on this, so this is very much a collaborative project. So this is just who's involved to start with, and there will be many more people, and I hope Turin will have a stake in this too. So the first strand of the project will be class and the economy, and it will aim to provide a granular analysis of the occupational structure of the Greek democratic cities with a particular focus, due to the nature of the extant evidence, but not exclusive focus on Athens. This will form the underpinning of the second, class identity, ideology and culture, third, class and politics, and fourth, class at the intersection, slaves, women and foreigners, strands. So in the last part of my presentation, after boring you with the state of the art and with theoretical consideration, I'll try to give you a sense of what I aim to achieve in these strands and bring some evidence to bear, okay? So 1, class and the economy. As I mentioned, the study of the ancient Greek economy has undergone a revolution since the turn of the millennium. In part, new archaeological approaches have shown the impossibility of the static, stagnant, and overwhelmingly agrarian economy on which the Finley School insisted. Field service and studies of other kinds of proxy data, human remains, shipwrecks, coin dice, amphoras, ice cores, have established that steady economic growth occurred over several centuries of Greek history, along with a gradual rise of living standards. The Copenhagen Polis Center's wide-ranging data collection has shown that the Greek world was highly urbanized, with most people living in urban environments rather than on rural farmsteads. It is increasingly recognized that long-term economic growth emerged in lockstep with an even more complex division of labor at the regional level and also within specific cities, with perhaps some 200 specialized occupations in the classical Athenian economy. In some places, artisans, traders, and market vendors constituted a significant proportion of the population, sometimes the majority of the population, and, contrary to Finley and what we used to believe, many of these workers were of citizen status. These were not just slaves and metics and foreigners. recent developments in the study of the economy show an economy with ample scope for the development of class relations and antagonisms. It is at Athens that we have the fullest evidence for the socio-economic structure of both the citizen and the non-citizen populations and for the rhythms of different kinds of work, but evidence can be found also for other polis. At Delos, centrally located in terms of Aegean trade routes and itself a bustling trading hub, artisans came to make up most of the small island's population in the Hellenistic period. At Aegina and Chios, for instance, a significant proportion of the demos was comprised of emporoi, maritime traders, who would typically spend the summer months at sea. A truly granular analysis of the occupational structure of the population of the Greek cities, and of Athens in particular, but not just Athens, will therefore allow for major gains, I think, in our understanding of the material interests of different segments of the population and of the reality and rhythms of their daily lives and their work lives, thus providing the underpinning for the wider investigation of the class dynamics of Greek democracies. The second strand is, of course, class identity, ideology, and culture. Here, a new understanding of Greek dynamics of honor, respect, and recognition, and of the values, emotions that inform and are informed by these dynamics, which had been the outcome, in fact, of my previous ERC grants, which I've just finished, provides, I think, a more solid conceptual basis for investigating, above all in the literary sources, the dynamics of deference, symbolic power, and distinction in interpersonal and inter-class relations, from embodied class markers, as in general demeanor, clothing, grooming, to cultural taste as markers of distinction, musical taste, gymnastic and athletics, communal eating, those forms. Equally, attention to popular culture and a deeper understanding of popular morality in its entanglement with religious beliefs allows for a more thorough investigation of the attitudes of the lower classes and of the ideological and conceptual weaponry at their disposal in restraining the high and mighty. In the first place, putting class opposition and class struggle at the center of the project's framework of interpretation will allow us, I think, to unpack the class entanglements of high-level philosophical reflection, which mirrored more general elite attitudes. The increasing focus on virtue, the key criterion for worth, value, axia, deciding who should partake of political power, was reconceptualized as dependent on scholae, on leisure, which takes money, doesn't it? The redefinition of notions of eleutheria to exclude the free poor and include only those who, on account of their means and leisure, can lead a liberal life, not just a free life. The association of banausia, manual work, which was associated with craftsmen, but extended to indicate all forms of manual work done for others, with douleia, with slavery. Working with your hands was equated to slavery. All these ideological shifts apply to many areas of cultural and social life, and most prominently to cultural taste in sport and music, were functional to justifying the exclusion of the masses from political power and participation, and to reaffirming the elite's oppositional class identity through stressing their distinction from the working classes, understood as low qua working. More widely, pursuing the implications in class terms of the dynamics of honor in Greek societies is an exercise that spans the historical sociology of emotion, intellectual history, and literary history, and the study of popular religion. Contestations of claims to respect and recognition in political speeches and in especially Aristotelian political theory are reflected, for instance, in prototypical characterizations of one's opponent's motives and emotions. The supposed dominance that we find all over the sources of envy in the popular masses, on which elite sources constantly insist, reflects elite stigmatization of claims that might otherwise be framed as just. The elite's refusal to recognize such claims can be framed, on the other hand, as contempt or as hubris, which is very much framed in the sources as a characteristic of the rich and powerful. One reason almost obsessively in our material, why the rich go wrong about honor and fall into hubris, is that they mistake luck for merit. We find that all the time. They thus fail to appreciate the lesson of a long literary tradition, from Homer to tragedy and beyond, that recurs repeatedly to the theme of the inability of wealth, rank, power, or skill to insulate human beings against sudden and violent changes of fortune. This is a pattern that affects all human beings regardless of class, and so can be the focus of moralizing that emphasizes a common human condition. For example, in the Iliad, in Sophocles' Antigonus, or in the Oedipus Tyrannus. But equally, in epic, tragedy, and historiography, this is also typically a pattern that the powerful fail to regard as applicable to them. It is, as the chorus of Aeschylus' Agamemnon recognize, not the poor, but the rich and powerful who furnish the salient examples of this. Their vulnerability also reflects attitudes regarding their place in the world on which non-elite resentment characteristically focuses. But in the traditional religious attitudes that these genres reflect, such attitudes also typically attract the resentment or indignation of the gods. Even the most powerful are impotent in the face of a universe that is not merely recalcitrant, but managed by divinities who seem to resent precisely those forms of behavior on the part of the powerful that most exercise their social inferiors. If tragic representations of the fall of the powerful do tend to leave structures of power in place, nonetheless, those who see themselves as born to leadership are typically humbled in this material. That this popular anti-elitist tendency is embedded in the civic and institutional context of the festivals in which the relevant work were performed is, after Bakhtin, a commonplace with regard to comedy, but there is no such consensus with regard, for instance, to tragedy and epic. There remains substantial scope for exploring the ways in which tragedy too reflects such perspectives. Tragedy, like epic and heredity and historiography too, regularly reaffirm popular ethical and religious views about human vulnerability and the limits that constrain even the strongest, ablest, and most powerful. This is a significant fact, not just about literary genres, but also about a major strand of the values reflected in important social and cultural contexts. Class dynamics and popular agency are reflected in a value system that scholars have normally read instead as elite-dominated. Class and politics. This strand, the easier one to an extent, will build on the investigation of the economic underpinnings of class oppositions and of the social and cultural construction of class preferences and identities to put class at the center of an account of the political dynamics and structures of Greek democracies. Against readings of Greek democracy as driven primarily by elite competition or as characterized by an ideological consensus between mass and elite, the evidence suggests, I think, that elites across the Greek world often saw democracy and what came with it, the power of the demos, of the masses, as an existential threat. For instance, a passage from the Luraghi states that some politicians say that the magistracies ought to be chosen by lottery. I think it's the least democratic thing possible, for there are men in the city-states police who hate the common people, and should the lottery select them, they will destroy the demos. Passages like these attest to the existence of fiercely anti-democratic partisans throughout the Greek world at the end of the 5th century, whose sympathies went to oligarchy and who actively despised the masses and dreaded their rule. 3/4 of a century later, Aristotle observes that in some cities the oligarchs take this oath: I will be malicious towards the demos and will devise whatever ill I am able against them. How nice. Beyond such impressionistic quotations, Matt Simonton's work on oligarchy has shown that the rise of Athenian democracy and fear of its spread played the role of a veritable boogeyman for 5th century elites around the Greek world. As a reaction to the possibility that the masses, the demos, may actually rule, as it did in Athens, elites from many cities moved away from traditional, fluid, prestige-based political regimes and attempted to entrench their power through new oligarchic constitutions that effectively disenfranchised entirely the lower classes. Such regimes were reactionary in the truest sense. They reacted to the spread of popular power and were fueled by the elite's fears of social and political displacement. Further work has pointed to important Hellenistic evidence, for instance in Polybius and elsewhere, of lively assembly meetings in Rhodes, in the Achaean League and elsewhere, with high levels of popular participation and with speakers behaving as demagogues, stirring up the crowd and playing up the stronger position between the few and the many. So this kind of dynamic continued, did not die out with the end of the classical period. It was relevant to centuries of Polish history. It seems clear that such an opposition existed then, and that it structured both the political life of many Greek cities and often those episodes of civil strife when normal political life broke down. Yet, as we have seen, scholars tend either to downplay it or to interpret it as a purely ideological, even contextual construction, with little correspondence to the actual articulation of society, let alone to particular economic groups and conditions. The sources, however, appear to tell a different story. Aristotle connects very tightly different constitutional forms and different kinds of democracy, more or less friendly to the wealthy, more or less stable or moderate, with the prominence of particular socioeconomic groups, which he calls mere, parts, or indeed classes, noting that democracies in which the demos mainly comprised farmers were less likely to be as radical as those with large numbers of artisans. The rhetoric to Alexander also stresses that in order for the owners of property to be secure from the plots of the masses, of the plethos, it is important that moderate democratic regimes honor and empower those who work the land rather than the people of the marketplace, the agoraioi. Elite writers often complain that the Athenian assembly is dominated by artisans and traders and that such men prefer the advice of craft specialists rather than wealthy, well-educated dilettanti, as in Plato's Protagoras. Still in the mid-2nd century BCE, Polybius reports how on a particular instance the General Assembly of the Achaean League jeered at the Roman legates, hooted and hustled them out of the meeting, noting with horror that never had there been collected such a pack of artisans and commoners. The evidence, that is, cries out not only for putting the dichotomy between mass and elite back at the center of the study of Greek democracy, but for grounding this dynamic in the new understanding of the occupational structure of particular democratic cities, which we would like to pursue in strand 1 of the project, and of how this translated into class-based or positive identities on the social and cultural planes. Such an approach hopefully will have transformative effects on a number of problems and debates about the evolution and the political structures of Greek democracy. One such issue is the extent and nature of popular participation in Greek democracy widely, and the ways in which elite managed to curtail it. Scholarship has often read particular institutional developments and measures as more or less favorable to widening popular participation. Yet the question is seldom asked as to what kind of popular participation a particular measure or development envisages, by what sections of the population, and with what kinds of attitudes to the wealthy elites. In the rare instances in which a more granular approach to popular participation is pursued, this has normally to do with participation from those living in non-urban areas, in non-urban demes. A more fine-grained appreciation of the occupational structure of the population will allow us to engage fully, for instance, with Aristotle's political analysis, which underscores the political consequences of regional economic specialization and the practical rhythms of work. So, one might ask, for instance, what political consequences followed from the preponderance of craftsmen in Delos, of fishermen in Byzantium and Tarentum, of maritime traders in Aegina and Chios? I've already noted Aristotle's preference for a moderate kind of democracy, where the demos was made up largely of farmers, a situation that Aristotle explicitly praises in relation to the rhythms of the farmer's work, which kept him away from town, allowing the right sort of people to run the state. Artisans, by contrast, lived mainly in town and faced no great journey to the assembly. And if their participation in politics was supported by state-funded pay, they could exercise a disproportionate, and for Aristotle very pernicious, effect on political life. The assumption here is that different occupational groups are bearers of distinctive class identities, which translate in distinctive political preferences and priorities. This assumption finds confirmation in the evidence. In Aristophanes' Ecclesiazusai, for instance, we find a debate on whether to launch the fleet in which the wealthy and the farmers are against the proposal, while the penetes, the poor, which here indicates the urban masses of craftsmen and shopkeepers, are in favor. And later in the debate on whether to hand the state to women, the mass of the showmakers are in favor while the farmers are against. Aristotle spends considerable efforts in Politics 4, chapter 14 to 16, detailing how to arrange or avoid political pay, combined with fines for absenteeism and the widespread use of election to prevent particular socioeconomic groups, craftsmen in particular, from achieving excessive influence in the running of the state. Some studies of particular Hellenistic polis, those, for example, by Roberta Fabiani, focused on Iasos, have already pointed out how certain institutional developments that limited or qualified direct access to deliberation by those who were not members of the wealthy elites seem to bear out some of Aristotle's suggestions and point to widespread elite efforts to restrict direct influence by the urban masses without putting the overall democratic regime into question. We find similar narrowing of decree-proposing powers in other cities. For example, we can see it well in Kos and Miletus, but also in other places. Conversely, the complaints by elite writers about the preponderance of craftsmen and shopkeepers in Athenian politics seem to be underscored by new studies of 4th century decree proposers and office holders, which have shown that the majority of attested Athenian decree proposers were neither members of the elite nor professional politicians, but average Athenians making proposals only occasionally on matters that interested them, particularly. Other work has stressed the influence of the urban lower classes in political deliberation beyond the proposing of decrees. An appreciation of the distinctive economic experiences, labor relations, and oppositional class identities of the different groups involved in these debates, of how these structure their daily and social lives, and of how these groups were constructed themselves as political and social agents in opposition to one another, will help us, I hope, make sense of particular institutional arrangements as well as of some striking legislative initiatives. Just two examples that are rather illustrative here. There was a law in Athens that made it illegal to insult citizens for working in the marketplace, a kind of insult that we find repeatedly levied in Aristophanes' comedies against politicians or of democratic tendencies, and even against Euripides' mother, who was allegedly a vegetable seller. And there is another law attributed to Lycurgus from the mid-4th century that provided that no woman should go to Eleusis in a carriage, lest the women of the people appear inferior to the rich, and if any woman should be caught doing this, she should pay a fine of 6,000 drachmas. A talent, that's a lot of money. Considerations of occupational differences and of how these were articulated into distinctive class preferences will also allow us to approach the question of the extent of redistribution in Greek democracies, I hope with new eyes. How consistent were particular kinds of political pay with the rhythm and seasonality of particular occupations? Providing pay for year-long political office would hardly have made it a possibility for farmers who could not abandon work, for instance, at harvest time in exchange for monetary compensation. And maritime traders would also have found it difficult to take advantage of it in the summer months. Craftsmen, shopkeepers, and day workers, conversely, could more easily choose to abandon their occupation for a limited time in exchange for political pay, or even use political pay as a safety net when times were hard. 6-month-long office could potentially provide additional income for maritime traders who did not sail during the winter months. Assembly pay could probably secure wide attendance from and provide additional income to urban craftsmen and traders, but was neither help to employ and farmers at certain times of the year. Conversely, pay for service in a judicial panel, which could be taken advantage of on particular days on a voluntary basis, could provide additional income at certain times for a wide number of occupational groups, while also potentially providing an old age pension of sorts, as strongly suggested by Aristophanes was. The redistributive potential of religious festivals and their importance for providing leisure and entertainment to the working classes will also need to be central to our investigation, in connection with the Bakhtinian notion of carnivalesque, whose relevance to democratic festivals is investigated in Strand 2. Discussion of redistribution through the funding of religious festivals has by and large concentrated on the introduction of pay for attending festivals, dramatic festivals in particular, in classical Athens, on how such pay developed over time, on the fiscal burden it entailed, and on the issues it created. Yet this form of redistribution by means of a monetary subsidy is only one aspect of the wider redistributive dimension of festivals. For instance, archaeological studies of bone remains from Athenian burials of individuals at different time periods and from different points of the social ladder, and we can tell from the burials, have shown the unusually high protein intake of classical Athenians compared to the Roman or Byzantine era descendants. It is possible and even likely that a key causal factor was the sheer number of publicly funded festivals in democratic cities with sacrifices and communal meat consumption. Leopold Migeot has shown that the fiscal burden in the Greek polis overwhelmingly fell on the very rich, both in the form of indirect taxation and for the remarkable quota of public expenses, not least for festivals, that were funded through direct targeted institutional mechanisms such as liturgies and colleges, aephori, semi-compulsory subscriptions or loans, as well as voluntary ergotism. It is then significant that the old oligarch complains that the Athenian demos exacted festivals from the rich as a tax, also noting that the Athenians held more festivals than any other city. And Theopompus confirms these statements, also connecting them directly to meat consumption and extending them beyond Athens, when he comments on the sheer number of public sacrifices that were held in democracies like Athens and Tarentum. Finally, point 4, much shorter than 3, class at the intersection. Slaves, women, foreigners. Studies of subaltern groups such as women, foreigners, and slaves have started to pay more attention to intersectional dynamics of subalternity, which in fact demand a renewed focus on class. This is needed first to achieve a better understanding of class differences and oppositions within particular subaltern groups: elite women against lower class women, rich foreigners against poor foreigners, wealthy slaves against poor slaves. We know, for instance, that slaves could possess other slaves, something like the equivalent of servi vicari at Rome, that some metics were enormously wealthy, whilst most were not, and that the working habits of poor citizen women differed enormously from those of their wealthy counterparts. Complicating these dynamics is the fact that conditions were not uniform across the Greek world. At Sparta, for example, a pervasive ideology of citizen leisure was so hostile to work that citizen women did not even weave at all, a highly unusual cultural practice. Other cultural markers set the Spartans apart from subaltern groups, such as special hairstyles versus slave dress. In Sparta, then, socioeconomic inequality was encoded in dress, leisure, and comportment. And oligarchs at Athens, who wished to live under a similar regime, groused about the blurry intersections of legal status and dress, bodies and comportment at Athens instead. We were discussing it this morning. Yet even at Athens, complex distinctions within groups, fueled by a greater scope for social mobility, allowed for strategies of distinction to be pursued. Class cut across all of this, so much so that Socrates' elite Athenian entourage far more comfortably rubbed shoulders with rich metics like Cephalus, in whose house the discussion of Plato's Republic begins, and rich men from other cities than with poorer members of their own citizen group. Likewise, the class overlap between slave, citizen, and metic artisans, based ultimately on shared occupation, while providing opportunities for socialization and even support across legal statuses in the free spaces studied by Kostas Vlasopoulos, led some members of the Athenian elite to lump them all together into a slavish class that, in their view, ought to have been excluded from the citizen body. The point of view of the demos was very different, and it took special pains to distinguish itself from the slaves, for instance, by making sure that corporal punishment were not applied to citizens, and that the bodies of citizens were treated as inviolate, so much so that magistrates were terrified of manhandling uncompliant citizen peers, and that those who enslaved free persons faced capital penalties. This was a world away from Sparta, where corporal punishment was meted out across all status groups. So an intersectional approach to subaltern statuses that has class at its core is fundamental to the wider project, but also to moving past the approach we discussed. So I've spoken enough to conclude, and without much understatement at this point, I'm Italian after all, not English. We've been said a lot of bad things about English. The aim of this project is to achieve, I hope, a root and branch reconceptualization of the driving dynamics of the society and politics of the ancient Greek city-states, putting class back at the center of our agenda as historian. That's the purpose. Now let's see how it goes. Thank you.
Well, one might dispute the fairness of asking questions on where the project will go, but since we have you here, I think that's exactly what we are going to do.
Yeah, and you can save me from mistakes and from wrong turns. Let's put it like that.
Oh, wrong. Floor is open for questions.
That was a lot. There was a lot of stuff there, wasn't there?
Go ahead.
Okay, I begin. Two questions. The first question is connected by the problem of a model of research about this question. I think of all Giovanni Battista Vico. In Giovanni Battista Vico, in Scienza Nuova, we have a disposition, a big analysis of the struggle class in the Roman Empire. Is an example very, very interesting because is similar to your project, but by the man of the 18th century. And this is very, very important, like possibility to have a model of paradigm analysis. The second question is connected by the problem of class and economy, class identity, ideology, and economy. In ancient regime, the problem of the struggle class is connected by the problem of the struggle against the corporation. The corporation is very, very important point of reference of struggle class. My curiosity is in the old, in the Greek world or in Roman Empire, we have the structure like the corporation. Because it's very important to have the reference. Because in ancient regime we have the problem of to create a commerce society, economic society. Completely different is, I think, in the whole world.
I'll start from the second one, I guess. So, there's been a lot of work done on associational culture in the Greek cities. And there's been a big project in Copenhagen, the Copenhagen Associations Project, that has in fact very much collected all the evidence for private and public associations and subdivisions. And what turned out there was that many of these in fact had both a cultic and an economic component. So if we have the small association of the winemakers of this small island, or the association of the Georgoi and that of the craftsmen, we have that kind of thing. No? One feature that is quite interesting about this world is that, so there is an economic element to this, and in fact the argument there has been very much made along the lines of creating associations that are a vehicle for social and economic trust. Sometimes these associations collect what they call friendly loans, eranoi, that then can be used for economic activity and the like. So there is a strong economic element. One thing that I think has been a bit underexplored is that wherever they appear, this association, and they're usually focused on one polis, although it may be the association of the foreign inhabitants in the polis, one feature that is very much there is what's being called isomorphism or homomorphism of their governance structures. So, for example, in these Greek cities, like all these associations basically function and are run more or less in the same way as the cities as a whole. They make decisions in the same way and so on. No? So, in that respect, there is both an economic angle, but also there's an element by which these groups tend to reproduce the political level and dimension. So, as I said, I have work to do on this, but I don't think those kind of transnational corporations or that kind of thing is really the problem they're fighting against. I think the problem is more like direct internal relation, or even fundamentally the battle between the elite that don't want to pay anything and the masses that want them to pay for a lot in a way. And the levels of extraction and redistribution are quite sustained at times. There's also been a lot of focus on trade and on commerce together with all this work on the dynamism of the economy. But the structures seem to be fairly different. We don't see really kind of a guild structure of that kind. And also, I suspect, and this is a part of the project I didn't even talked about because it's just kind of a half-cooked idea, no? I suspect that what is both remarkable about Greek democracy and explains its length and its economic success to an extent is not much that democracy per se fosters economic growth, as Ober or others have said, but the fact that one big feature of early on of the Democratic Pact was the fact that although much of the power seemed to be concentrated in the hands of urban craftsmen and so on, one thing we find across the board is that there's no direct taxation on land. So there's no extraction of agricultural surplus, which is kind of rare in pre-modern society, almost unheard of. And that also means that you've got a lot of people that have money to spend and that can feed local markets and all this kind of thing. So you do get a sense that a first market is not just an elite market, but even just local farmers from the countryside that will come to the city and buy stuff and sell their crops. And also you know that because trade is strong, farmers will decide to privilege market crops very often, rather than just get subsistent grain going. There's going to be figs, olives, wine, the kind of thing they can sell around because they know they can get grain from elsewhere and they can make money and buy. So that's a move toward market economy. So I think these are precisely the kind of issues we need to figure out. And I suspect the answer will not be the same across the board because this is, after all, a world of over 1,000 cities. And they're not, although there is a uniformity, they're not quite the same with one another. So that's why we need a granular analysis of the occupational structure of each one, how they, at least where you can do it, in a way. On the first question about Vico and paradigms, yeah, I mean, I think this project, I did kind of a short-term state-of-the-art history of scholarship that I thought was necessary to justify why I'm even doing this in a way, no? But I do think that there has to be a longer-term history of thought about these matters that actually arches back before Marx and Marxism and those kind of problems. Because it is fascinating that even already in the Renaissance, when they start dealing with Athens, like Carlo Sigonio, when he writes the Republica Ateniensium, which is the first real treatise, his key is basically popular masses against kind of elites. He reads it in the evidence, he connects it with the world of his own city-states, he doesn't quite like the popular masses. So, in a funny way, this has been the keys across the century. That's how they read this word. So that's kind of my contention. I think this bracketing out class from the analysis that has happened in the last 40 years is a fluke, which has got more to do with political developments and cultural developments in our own world and in academia than with what's the best explanatory model for this material. So a long history of how people have discussed this stuff needs to be done, I think. But thank you very much. Yeah, Mitch?
I have only a little doubt. In the second point, class identity, the ideology.
Yeah.
How can you reconstruct and to what extent the ideology, and cultural identity from what tools?
Yeah, so my position about that is that there's been a lot of work done on popular culture, and people claim that, I don't know, people look at Aesop or that kind of stuff. My position is that elite sources seem to talk about popular justice, popular culture, and political institution as fundamentally popular. There's been a tendency among scholars to read this stuff as like domesticated elite culture. I don't buy it. Like in the 5th century, for example, elite culture is outside of the institutions. Is the kind of stuff that you find in Italian, is the kind of stuff that you find in symposia, is the kind of world where Delicleon takes Philocleon at the end of the play when he convinces him not to go to the locals anymore, no? And there is this sense that inside the culture of the institution in a place like 5th century democracy is kind of more familiar and more comfortable for the masses than it is for the elites. So I think, to an extent, we need to get out of this automatism that popular culture is always unauthorized, unofficial culture. That's true in the modern world. In the world of Greek democracy, it's not necessarily true. But also, though, like, I was focusing on things like tragedy and those kind of things because that is specifically cultural forms that, although they are sophisticated and may be considered elite, they are conceived to a mass audience. Everybody goes to tragedy. This stuff needs to be appealing to everybody. And I do find it interesting that you do find this kind of, I don't want to call it popular morality or something like that, but there is this light anti-elite slant. I mean, arrogance, hubris, overestimating your wealth, overestimating your power, and so on, never seem to go very well. And this is kind of an underexplored aspect, but I do admit that is the part of the project on which we need to do more work, and it will be also conceptually be the more difficult to figure out because we need to be very, very careful about what sources we use, how we read them. First step is not assuming that just because a source is still here, it's transmitted, need to be elite source, an elite source. I don't think that's true across the board. But yeah, I take your point. I think you're right that that's the one I need to do more work on, I guess.
Just a very short remark about the sort of Roman conservation. Well, also for the Roman side, the association was not a problem. I don't think there were problems for class struggle with the association, which we call collegia. The only one maybe was the publicans. As collector. In the 18th century historiography were theoretically compared with the termination in Rome. So the problem of tax collection maybe was the only aspect in which, for us, for Roman history, there was a sort of class struggle. I don't know in Greek world, the tax collector were conceived.
No.
Yeah, it doesn't. It seems to work the other way around. Like, tax collection is a problem for the elites. They hate the stuff because, I mean, that's one thing that people often don't realize. I mean, in Athens, only 4%, only the top 4% of the population paid any direct taxes.
The same things for Rome. Rome Republic.
Yeah.
But they paid a lot of, they paid a lot of direct taxes. Of course, Italia, or...
Yeah, in the Greek world there is indirect taxation, but seem not to be very, very high. And but that's one place where you can really see development. I mean, in classical Greece, in classical Athens, for example, I mean, the liturgical rate of organizing festivals is entirely on the top 4%, and it's heavy. It's really heavy. And the result of that is, for example, that you find that Osborne has collected quite a lot of evidence for just the need for liquidity. Like, even the richest families, like, sometimes they didn't have the cash to kind of pay this kind of stuff. And also Davies has noted that you hardly ever find in Athens an elite family that lasts more than 2 generations or 3. So the social mobility is also downwards. Like, these people have to pay a lot. By the time you get, for example, after the Lamian War, one of the first things they get rid of is liturgies and colleges, and they replace them with what they call agonothesia. This magistrate that pays for, there's not just in Athens, but in Athens we know it better, this guy that administers all the festival, and they make a big song and dance when the guy decides to make a private donation, as if it was this great thing. But of course the private donation is a fraction of what his class used to pay before, whereas most of the money now comes from indirect taxation that is spread around. So what you find there, I think, is a redistribution of the taxation load from the rich to the poor. And that is exactly the kind of change that we need to investigate. But that's a battleground. I mean, that's a battleground. Who's going to pay for the stuff? Because there is a moment in Greek history in which it's only the rich people that pay for the stuff, and they don't like it. They keep saying they don't like it. So yeah.
Do you remember that Mogliano did not like the Vico example?
Yeah, I didn't.
Refused the Vico example, Mogliano.
Mm-hmm.
Right against the use by Vico the example of the struggle class in Roman Empire.
Yeah, in the Roman.
It's a big question in Marxist historiography.
Yeah.
Padaloni and another historian used the example of Vico.
Yeah, he was funny because he published a couple of articles, survey articles about Greek assemblies. Have you ever seen this? But apparently those were just small articles that came out of massive collection of evidence, which is still in his papers, of all kind of Greek assemblies, who decided, who had the power, and so on. And in later years, it seems that he was considering going back to the work as a positive response to the St. Croix book, who actually had been a student many years before. So Mogliano was not a Marxist historian, but he was way more open to that kind of approach than others. And he was the one that very nicely identified, I think, the pitfalls with, although he was a big fan of Finlay, with the spectrum of statuses model, the fact that you cannot explain historical change to that kind of stuff, because you've got basically, like, you have a structural analysis with all these groups, one next to the other, but it's unclear what they're doing to each other, how they work with each other, and he very clearly saw that, and he made the point. So, but yeah, I do think that, like, at some point I want to kind of start looking at Mogliano's engagement with Marxist historiography. Also, he learned Russian just for the purpose of engaging with what was going on the other side. Was kind of disappointed when he did, but he wanted to know what was happening there.
Yeah. Well, I suppose I'm going to wrap up this discussion with an open invitation to Professor Canevaro to come back with the results of his research in years' time, and have more discussions on this. But for the time being, we want to thank him again for his very